So why do we need to write an introduction for our essay? When we write an introduction, the introduction introduces the topic and also gives context to our thesis statement. The introduction also tells the reader what will the essay be about. And then the three parts of an introduction paragraph are the hook, 5 background sentences, and the thesis statement. And so in the introduction, you always place the thesis statement, which is the main idea sentence, as the last sentence of the first paragraph. And so if you want to learn more about introductions, you can also Google funnel introduction paragraph, and that is spelled Funnel. And in another one of my videos, I go over different kinds of introductions. So if you go to Professor H writing channel and you search different kinds of introductions, then my video on different kinds of introductions will pop up. So today we're going to go over why do we use introductions in our essay. And so this handout was written by Quillbot, English Composition 2, Rhetorical Methods, Introductions. So the role of introductions. Introductions and conclusions can be the most difficult parts of a paper to write. Usually when you sit down to respond to an assignment, you have at least some sense of what you want to say in the body of your paper. You might have chosen a few examples you want to use, or have an idea that will help you answer your question, help you answer the main question of your assignment. And so these sections, therefore, are not hard to write. But the middle parts can't just come out of thin air. They need to be introduced and concluded in a way that makes sense to your reader. Your introduction and conclusion act as bridges that transport your readers from their own lives into the place of your analysis. If your readers pick up your paper about education in the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, for example, they need a transition to help them leave behind the world of 20th century life and to help them temporarily enter the world of 19th century American slavery. By providing an introduction that helps your readers make a transition between their own world and the issues you will be writing about, you give your readers the tools they need to get into your topic and care about what you are saying. Similarly, once you hook your reader with the introduction and offered evidence to prove your thesis, your conclusion can provide a bridge to help your readers make the transition back to their daily lives. And so, and when we write conclusions, the conclusion gives the reader closure. And so sometimes it's difficult for a writer to write a good introduction and to write a good conclusion. So to repeat, an introduction is the very first paragraph that introduces the topic of your paper. Your introduction gets your reader to care about your topic. And your introduction has, once again, I'll repeat it, the 3 parts. It's worth repeating. Hook, 5 background sentences, and then your thesis statement. Then just like your conclusion introduces the topic, your conclusion concludes the topic. And your conclusion also has 3 parts. You start out by repeating your thesis statement as the first sentence. Then you summarize your essay in 5 sentences. And then you give some prediction or some kind of what is your lasting impression you want the reader to have, and what takeaway lessons you want the readers to learn by reading your essay. So I'll go over more about conclusion in the next essay. In this essay, I want to focus more on introduction. So why bother writing a good introduction? You never get a second chance to make a first impression. The opening paragraph of your paper will provide your readers with their initial impressions of your argument, your writing style, and the overall quality of your work. A vague, disorganized, error-filled, off-the-wall, or boring introduction will probably create a negative impression. On the other hand, a concise, engaging, and well-written introduction will start your readers off thinking highly of you, your analytical skills, your writing, and your paper. This impression is especially important when the audience you are trying to reach, your instructor, will be grading your paper. Your introduction is an important roadmap for the rest of your paper. Your introduction conveys a lot of information to your readers. You can let them know what your topic is, why it is important, and how you plan to proceed with your discussion. In most academic disciplines, your introduction should contain a thesis statement that will assert your main argument. It should also ideally give the reader a sense of the kinds of information you will use to make that argument and the general organization of the paragraphs and pages that will follow. After reading your introduction, your readers should not have any surprises in store when they read the main body of your paper. And so when you write your thesis statement, you have a topic, you have your opinion and reasons. And then reason 1, reason 2, reason 3 in your thesis statement will then become your body paragraphs. And so your thesis statement is just like your introduction, is an important roadmap for the rest of your paper. Ideally, your introduction will make your readers want to read your paper. The introduction should capture your readers' interest, making them want to read the rest of your paper. Opening with a compelling, so now they're talking mainly about a hook. So how could you write a hook? The first sentence of an introduction is a hook, and that's where you hook the reader into your paper. So there are many different kinds of hooks. You can have a hook that is a compelling story. Your hook could be a fascinating quotation. Your hook can be an interesting question. Or your hook could be a stirring example that can get your reader to see why this topic matters. And your hook will serve as an invitation for them to join you for an interesting intellectual conversation. So I also have, if you go to my Professor H writing channel, I also have a video called Different Kinds of Hooks. So that way you can learn different ways that you can hook your reader from the very first sentence to readers to care about your topic. Strategies for writing an effective introduction. Start by thinking about the question or questions you are trying to answer. Your entire essay will be a response to this question, and your introduction is the first step toward that end. Your direct answer to the assigned question will be your thesis. Your thesis will be included in your introduction, so it is a good idea to use the question as a jumping point. Imagine that you are assigned the following question. Education has long been considered a major force for American social change, righting the wrongs of our society, drawing on the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. Discuss the relationship between education and slavery in 19th century America. Consider the following. So this talks about how do I write a good introduction? First, you have to have good research questions. Ask yourself, what am I curious about? What do I want to write about? And then the answers to your research question, this is a kind of pre-writing, it's known as questioning, and the answers to your research questions will become your thesis statement. So here are some research questions about Frederick Douglass and education. How did white control of education reinforce slavery? How did Frederick Douglass and other enslaved African Americans view education while they endured slavery? And what role did education play in the acquisition of freedom? Most importantly, consider the degree to which education was or was not a major force for social change with regard to slavery. So if you're going to write, for example, a paper about slavery and Frederick Douglass, then you have to ask yourself these research questions. And then the answer to these research questions, as I said before, become your thesis statement and then become the basis for your paper. You will probably refer back to your assignment extensively as you prepare your complete essay. And the prompt itself can also give you some clues about how to approach the introduction. Notice that it starts with a broad statement that education has been considered a major force for social change, and then narrows the focus on specific questions from the book. One strategy might be to use a similar model in your own introduction. Start off with a big picture sentence or two about the power of education as a force for change, as a way of getting your reader interested, and then focus on the details of your assignment about Douglass. Of course, a different approach could also be very successful. Decide how general or broad your opening will be. Keep in mind that even a big picture needs to be clearly related to your topic. An opening sentence that said, "Human beings, more than any other creatures on earth, are capable of learning," would be too broad for your assignment. If you have ever used Google Maps or similar programs, that experience can provide a helpful way of thinking about how broad your opening should be. Imagine that you're researching Chapel Hill. If you want to find out whether Chapel Hill is at roughly the same latitude as Rome, it might make sense to hit that little minus sign on the online map until it has zoomed all the way and you can see the whole globe. If you're trying to figure out how to get from Chapel Hill to Wrightsville Beach, it might make more sense to zoom in to the level where you could see most of North Carolina. So you have to figure out so basically they're telling you how broad or how specific should the beginning of your introduction be. And that depends on what you're writing about. And so basically for me, when you write a hook, just keep it so that you just want to hook the reader in. And you can use a quotation, you could use a interesting fact, you could use a couple of lines of an anecdote, you could use a couple of lines of a well-known story, like it was the worst of times and it was the best of times. This was the beginning or the hook, the most famous hook for Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. So try writing your introduction last. Okay, a lot of my students get stuck coming up with an introduction or get stuck coming up with a thesis statement. And I tell my students that, well, since your thesis statement is the summary of your body paragraphs, why don't you just write your body paragraphs first, then write your introduction and your thesis statement last. So that's another approach to writing your paper. So here I'll read this part. You may think that you have to write your introduction first, but that isn't necessarily true. It isn't always the most effective way to craft a good introduction. You may find that you don't know what you're going to say or how you're going to begin the writing process. And so only through the experience of writing your paper do you discover your main argument. It is perfectly fine to start out thinking you want to argue a particular point, but wind up arguing something slightly or even dramatically different by the time you've written most of the paper. Oh, that means that, let's say you start your paper and you're for abortion, for instance. Then you read a lot of articles and then you realize, oh, I think I'm going to be against abortion. So when you write your thesis statement, it's okay to suddenly switch and change your mind based on the research that you've done. It's also okay to tweak your thesis statement, because a lot of students think that once they write down their thesis statement, it's written in stone, but that's not the case. You can always change your thesis statement as many times as you want as you do your research or your literature review. So that's totally part of the fun of research, is the fact that you could change your mind as many times as you want. And so it is perfectly fine that you want to argue a particular point, but wind up with something totally different. The writing process can be an important way to organize your idea, think through complicated issues, refine your thoughts, and develop a sophisticated argument. However, an introduction written at the beginning of that discovery process will not reflect what you wind up with in the end. You will need to revise your paper and make sure that the introduction, all of the evidence, and the conclusion reflect the argument you intend. Sometimes it's easiest to just write up all your evidence first and then write the introduction last. That way you can be sure that the introduction will match the body of the paper. That's what I was talking about first. Some people want to just write down what they read. In other words, some people write their body paragraphs first. Then they write their introduction and conclusion last. And That's fine, as long as when you finish with your paper that your thesis statement reasons match the topic sentences of your body paragraphs, so that the teacher will see that you understand 5-paragraph essay structure. How you get there is up to you. Don't be afraid to write a tentative introduction first and then change it later. Some people think they need to write some kind of introduction in order to get the writing process started. But that's fine. If you are one of those people, be sure to return to your initial introduction later and rewrite if necessary. And here you have different kinds of hooks. Open with an attention grabber. Sometimes, especially if the topic is really boring or technical, you need to open your hook needs to be really catchy. So here you have different kinds of hooks. You could have an intriguing example. You can have a provocative quotation. You can have a puzzling scenario. You could have a vivid and perhaps unexpected anecdote, or you could have a thought-provoking question. Pay attention to your first sentence. Oh, that's the hook. Start off on the right foot with your readers by making sure that the first sentence actually says something useful and that it does so in an interesting and error-free way. Be straightforward and confident. Avoid statements like, in this paper, I will argue. When you write your thesis statement, just stick to the facts. Avoid saying, I'm going to talk about whatever, or in this paper, I will argue this. Those are all unnecessary words. All you have to do is just write the thesis statement. Here's an example. So let's say I say, in this paper, I will talk about how abortion is immoral. That's so unnecessary. Instead, just say, abortion is immoral because. That's all you need to say. So be straightforward and confident and knock out the unnecessary words. How to evaluate your introduction draft. Ask a friend to read it and then tell you what he or she expects the paper will discuss, what kinds of evidence the paper will use, and what the tone of the paper will be. If your friend is able to predict the rest of the paper accurately, you probably have a good introduction. So it's a good idea to have someone else help you revise your paper, look over your paper, and you could also take a break. So don't just try to write your paper all in one sitting and then try to correct your paper all in one sitting, because you the writer, you're going to become way too close to the paper. So it's good to take a break. Go outside, take a walk, and then you come back, you clear the cobwebs, and then you're going to find you're able to find more mistakes. 5 kinds of less effective introductions. The placeholder introduction. When you don't have much to say on a given topic, it is easy to create this kind of introduction. Essentially, this kind of weaker introduction contains several sentences that are vague and don't really say much. They exist just to take up introduction space in your paper. If you had something more effective to say, you would probably say it. But in the meantime, this paragraph is just a placeholder. Example. Slavery was one of the greatest tragedies in American history. There were many aspects of slavery. Each created different kinds of problems for enslaved people. None of this has anything to do, this is too general and kind of on the tangent has to do with Frederick Douglass and education. But if you want to be more specific, you need to mention Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a very prominent educator. And thanks to Frederick Douglass and his stories, people learned about the cruelties of slavery. For instance, that's a much better and more specific introduction. And this one is just too vague. The restated question introduction. Restating the question can sometimes be an effective strategy, but it can be easy to stop at just restating the question instead of offering a more interesting introduction to your paper. The professor or teaching assistant wrote your questions and will be reading 10 to 70 essays in response to them. So he or she does not need to read a whole paragraph that simply restates the question. Try to do something more interesting. Indeed, education has long been considered a major force for American change, righting the wrongs of our society. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass discusses the relationship between education and slavery in 19th century America, showing how white control of education reinforced slavery and how Douglass and other enslaved African Americans viewed education while they endured slavery. Moreover, the book discusses the role that education played in the acquisition of freedom. Education was a major force for social, so that's a much better introduction, because you can add some, you don't just restate the writing prompt, you add some more interesting facts related to the question. And since the question related to education, Frederick Douglass, and social change, then you can add some extra facts that relates to Frederick Douglass, social change, and education. Let's see. The Webster Dictionary Introduction. This introduction begins by giving the dictionary definition of one or more words in the assigned question. This introduction strategy is on the right track. If you write one of these, you may be trying to establish the important terms of the discussion, and this move builds a bridge to the reader by offering a common agreed-upon definition for a key idea. You may also be looking for an authority that will lend credibility to your paper. However, anyone can look up a word in a dictionary and copy down what Webster says. It may be far more interesting for you and for your reader if you develop your own definition of the term in the specific context of your class and assignment, or if you use a definition from one of the sources you've been reading in class. Also recognize that the dictionary is also not a particularly authoritative work. It doesn't take into account the context your course offers. If you feel that you must seek an authority, try to find one that is very relevant and specific. Perhaps a quotation from a source reading might prove better. Dictionary introductions are also ineffective simply because they are so overused. Many graders will simply see 20 or more papers that begin in this way. That greatly decreases the dramatic impact that any of these papers will have. The Dawn of Man introduction. This kind of introduction generally makes broad, sweeping statements about the relevance of this statement since the beginning of time. It is usually very general and familiar. You may write this kind of introduction when you don't have much to say, which is probably why it is ineffective. So, example, since the dawn of man, slavery has been a problem in human history. So here, the Dawn of Man introduction is just too broad, too cliche, and everybody does that. So try to avoid placeholders like saying since the beginning of time. The book report introduction. This introduction is what you had to do for your elementary school book reports. It gives the name and author of the book you are writing about, tells what the book is about, and offers other basic facts about the book. You might resort to this sort of introduction when you are trying to fill space, but because it's a familiar, comfortable format, but it is ineffective. I get a lot of book report papers. It's usually when in literature classes. Students seem to think that if they just retell the plot, then that's it for the analysis of the literature that they're reading. And so if all they do is just retell, anybody can just retell the plot. When you write a good introduction or a good literary analysis, then I want your take on the paper, on whatever it is you're reading. I want your life experience and what you bring to the table. So for example, I would say, as an Asian American reading Amy Tan's Joy Luck Club, there are many points that I agree with, that I've personally experienced the conflict between being an American or my obligations to obeying the family and being Asian, as opposed to the book Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan is a book about the conflicts in an Asian American family between mothers and daughters. Okay, that's so book report. Instead, you would write about as a Mexican American, and as I was reading The Joy Luck Club, I can relate to that book because in a Mexican family, we also have obligations to family. Family is way more important than what an individual wants or thinks. Now that's a good analysis. You're not doing a book report. So if you're in a literature class, please do not retell the plot, because that is a book report paper. However, if you're in second grade and you want to teach your kid how to write a good book report, then that's fine. Anyway, so that's it for this particular video. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me anytime.